After being blinded in a serious accident, the arrogant CEO falls in love with his ugly maid, unaware that she is keeping a big secret. Stay until the end to find out the twist in this story. But first, subscribe to the channel and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Ji-tae-moon was the kind of man who controlled everything around him with an almost icy precision. At 29, he had already transformed Tae Group into one of Korea's largest corporations, and his name was synonymous with success and power. For Tae-moon, emotions and weaknesses were unnecessary distractions. He was the perfect CEO, strategic, ruthless, and always several steps ahead of any adversary. But that night, as he left an exhausting meeting, he didn't foresee the accident that would change everything. The impact was abrupt, and when Tae-moon opened his eyes in the hospital, all he saw was darkness. The news that his blindness was temporary brought little comfort. The mere fact of not being able to see was enough to leave him feeling vulnerable and furious. Back at his mansion, Tae-moon isolated himself from the world. The staff received strict orders to limit their presence as much as possible, and he began coordinating the company remotely, tolerating no mistakes. He was more impatient, irritable, and determined not to show any sign of weakness. Still, he needed help at home, so his nurse recommended hiring an assistant. Reluctantly, Tae-moon agreed, as long as she was discreet and efficient. In another part of the city, Im Ha-yoon, a 24-year-old heiress to a rival empire, was facing her own problems. Her grandfather, the president of JBC Group, insisted that she marry Park Min-jae, an ambitious man with a clear interest in her family's power. In a moment of impulsive decision, Ha-yoon resolved to run away. She dressed in baggy clothes and used heavy makeup to hide her true appearance, transforming herself into someone unrecognizable. In disguise, she spent days looking for work, determined to distance herself from her luxurious life. That's when she found a job opening for a household assistant at a CEO's mansion. On her first morning, as she entered the mansion, Ha-yoon felt the tense atmosphere. The windows were almost always closed, the air felt heavy, and the silence was uncomfortable. Tae-moon quickly sensed her presence. Even without seeing her, he seemed to catch her every movement. As she approached to serve breakfast, he broke the silence with a cold voice. "Stop with that hesitant walking. It sounds like you're tiptoeing around," he said, laced with sarcasm. Ha-yoon hesitated for a moment, but forced herself to keep her composure, responding in a low, polite voice. "I just didn't want to disturb you, sir." "I don't need your consideration. Just be efficient," Tae-moon replied, his tone impatient. She set the tray on the table, irritated by his rudeness, but left the room without responding. However, something inside her compelled her to prove to him that she wouldn't be intimidated. The next morning, while cleaning the living room, she heard firm footsteps. Tae-moon was crossing the room, supported by a cane, yet with a rigid and proud stride. Sensing her presence, he halted, annoyed. "Are you just going to stand there, breathing as if you want to be invisible?" he asked, his tone cutting. Not wanting to appear submissive, Ha-yoon replied with a hint of irony. "I'm only following your orders to be efficient, sir." There was a brief silence. Tae-moon seemed surprised, perhaps even a little intrigued by her bold response. But he merely scoffed and continued on his way, ending the conversation. As the days went by, Tae-moon didn't seem to tire of testing her patience. He complained about the sound of her footsteps, criticized her way of cleaning, and pointed out faults whenever he could. One day, as she was helping him down the stairs, he brusquely rejected her support. "I'd rather trip than rely on someone else," he said, his voice full of bitterness and pride. Tired of his arrogant behavior, Ha-yoon retorted for the first time. "Well, if you trip, maybe you'll realize that pushing everyone away doesn't help at all," she murmured, still holding his arm despite his resistance. Tae-moon was silent, clearly surprised. No one had ever dared to challenge him like that, especially someone he viewed as an insignificant servant. He felt a small spark of curiosity, but quickly ignored it, returning to treating her with the same coldness. That night, Ha-yoon thought about giving up. Working for Tae-moon was exhausting, and the way he treated her tested the limits of her patience. But something kept her from leaving. Deep down, she was beginning to see that Tae-moon wasn't just cold and insensitive. He seemed trapped in a bitterness that prevented anyone from getting close. This realization stirred a conflict within her. While he irritated her, she also felt an inexplicable desire to understand what lay behind that hostility. Meanwhile, on the other side of the mansion, Taemoon couldn't get his new assistant out of his mind. He was used to submissive employees who never dared to contradict him. But this young woman was different. She challenged him in a new way, and though he wouldn't admit it, the memory of her firm response echoed in his mind. For the first time, someone didn't seem to care about his coldness or his power. The days at Taemoon's mansion became increasingly unpredictable for Hayoon. Each morning, she woke up feeling a mix of exhaustion and curiosity, uncertain whether she'd face an even more hostile Taemoon or perhaps, just maybe, a slightly more intrigued one. Despite the challenge of dealing with a blind, temperamental CEO, something in her felt compelled to stay, as if drawn by a desire to unravel the mysteries surrounding the man who seemed locked in his own emotional prison. She tried to carry out her duties without drawing attention, but his sharp temperament made avoiding conflict nearly impossible. One cloudy morning, Hayoon brought breakfast to the living room, where Taemoon waited, his face tense, jaw clenched, hands folded on his lap, as though he were in a constant state of vigilance. Sensing her presence, he raised an eyebrow, as if doubting her competence. "I hope the coffee's hot this time," he said, impatience edging his tone. Hayoon took a deep breath, keeping her calm. "Yes, sir, it's hot. The sugar is on your left," she replied, steadying herself to sound polite. Taemoon reached out hesitantly, finding the cup. Her hand lightly guided his with gentle precision, almost protective. He paused for a second, feeling the soft touch of her fingers on his skin. Hayoon noticed the brief connection as well, but quickly withdrew her hand, reminded of his typical rudeness. He regained his impassive expression almost immediately, as if nothing had happened. "I don't need your help holding a cup. Save your sympathy for someone who cares," he said, pulling the cup away, trying to mask the strange warmth he'd felt. "Of course, sir, I'll remember that," Hayoon replied with a slight smile. She was beginning to understand that he resisted any gesture of kindness, but that brief touch made her heartbeat race a bit more than she expected. Despite her effort to control her thoughts, Taemoon was unexpectedly beginning to evoke empathy in her. Strangely, she started to feel that his harsh demeanor might be hiding more than arrogance and hostility. That same afternoon, while organizing items in his office, he abruptly called her back. "Are you always this quiet?" Taemoon asked, leaning on his cane. Confused by his question, Hayoon responded without delay. "You instructed me not to disturb you. I'm just following your orders." "I didn't say to be invisible, just efficient. But you irritate me with that restrained manner." She noted a slight hesitation in his voice, as if he were analyzing her. Taemoon seemed to want to understand who this gentle-voiced yet unexpectedly assertive young woman truly was. "There are many ways to be efficient, and believe me, being invisible isn't my preferred style," she replied, trying to sound confident. For a moment, he almost laughed, so softly it was barely noticeable. A faint smile crossed Taemoon's face, not the arrogant smirk she knew, but something closer to relief, as though that fleeting bit of lightness allowed him to escape his rigidity. "Careful what you wish for. I'm a demanding man, Miss Hayoon," he said, still with an enigmatic expression. Taemoon's words left Hayoon unsettled. For a moment, she almost dropped the tray she was holding, but quickly composed herself. She found herself increasingly intrigued by his behavior, by this duality between the arrogant, distant man and the human being, who, despite resisting all displays of affection, seemed to desperately need someone by his side. The next morning, she found him in the garden, sitting with his eyes closed, his face turned toward the sun. Without him noticing, Hayoon stood watching him, wondering how many layers of repressed feelings he kept hidden. Sensing her presence, he turned his head in her direction. "Are you watching me, Miss Hayoon?" he asked, his voice softer than usual, as if the garden's stillness made him more introspective. Hayoon felt her cheeks warm, but she replied honestly, "I just find it interesting how someone who seems to need no one sometimes looks so alone." He frowned, clearly bothered. "Be careful with what you think. Opinions are irrelevant to me, especially yours," he replied, his tone sharp. Hayoon, however, was undeterred and managed to smile, though tinged with sadness. "Well, for me, loneliness isn't something to be ignored," she said as she stepped back, leaving him to his thoughts. Later that night, lying in his darkened room, Taemoon found himself reflecting on her words. As much as he tried to distance himself emotionally, there was something in this simple assistant's presence that began to challenge his defenses. He felt a strange curiosity that was beyond his control. As weeks passed, the bond between Taemoon and Ha-yoon grew quietly, almost without them realizing it. Each interaction brought a subtle closeness that went beyond words, revealing a connection neither could fully explain. However, Ha-yoon knew her time in disguise was running out. Her grandfather had intensified the search for her, and the possibility of her secret being exposed grew by the day. One night, as she organized papers in the office, she overheard Taemoon on the phone, arguing with his board members. The Tae Group directors were pressuring him to form a strong alliance to fortify the company amid the fierce competition with the JBC Group, her own family's conglomerate. When he hung up, she noticed a weary expression on his face, something that looked like a mixture of frustration and resignation. Before she could stop herself, she asked, "Is everything all right?" He turned in the direction of her voice, his face showing a mix of surprise and exhaustion. "Do you know what happens when people in power feel threatened by competition?" He replied, almost rhetorically. "They demand drastic measures." Ha-yoon nodded but sensed there was more in his response than he was letting on. They fell silent, and she felt the weight of the secret she carried. With each passing day, hiding it was becoming more painful. But before she could think of a way out, fate intervened. The next morning, while she was serving breakfast, Taemoon received an unexpected visit. Her grandfather, the president of JBC Group. As soon as she saw her grandfather's imposing figure entering the mansion, her heart raced. She stepped back, positioning herself discreetly to avoid being seen, but she overheard every word of their conversation. "Mr. Ji Taemoon," her grandfather began in a cold, authoritative tone. "I've come to propose an alliance between our companies, something that would solidify both groups and keep our competitors at bay." Taemoon listened carefully, intrigued. "And what's your proposal?" he asked, keeping his tone controlled and businesslike. "A marriage contract," the JBC president replied bluntly. "With my granddaughter, Im Ha-yoon. We believe that a union between our families would strengthen our companies, especially now that the markets are more competitive." Taemoon remained silent for a few moments, considering. Ha-yoon, still hidden near the door, felt the ground drop beneath her feet. She knew her grandfather was making a decision without consulting her, more interested in securing the family empire than in her own well-being. Taemoon himself seemed skeptical, but practical enough to see the benefit that such a marriage could bring. "I accept," he said after a long silence. Upon hearing this, Ha-yoon felt her world collapse. In a matter of minutes, her life had been decided without her having any say in it. Her grandfather gave a satisfied smile and added, "She'll be here soon. I understand your condition prevents you from meeting her in person now, but I trust she'll be a good wife and bring prosperity to both of us." After the visit, Taemoon seemed distant, immersed in his thoughts. Ha-yoon tried to avoid him as much as possible that day, fighting the panic and confusion she felt. How could he agree to something so impersonal without considering what it would mean? By evening, she finally gathered her courage. Determined to confront her own fate, Ha-yoon entered the office where Taemoon was, trying to organize her thoughts. Without realizing it was her, he spoke without lifting his head. "You've been thinking about what you heard today?" She swallowed hard, responding with a voice that was shaky yet resolved. "Yes, and frankly, I'm surprised that anyone would accept something as impersonal as a marriage of convenience." He laughed bitterly, still unaware he was speaking with Ha-yoon herself. Life is easier when you keep personal and professional matters separate. Power requires sacrifices. Besides, you wouldn't understand. This time, she couldn't hold back her response. "Maybe I understand more than you think." A tense silence fell between them, as if Taemoon were absorbing the weight of her words. He stood up, surprised by her boldness, his expression hardening. "Why does it feel like you're hiding something from me?" Her heart raced, and for the first time, she hesitated to maintain her disguise. But before she could answer, they were interrupted by one of the directors, and the moment for revealing her identity slipped away. In the following days, preparations for the wedding began, and Ha-yoon felt increasingly trapped in a lie from which she couldn't escape. Taemoon, meanwhile, prepared himself for a cold, pragmatic union, still unaware that his own assistant was the woman he was going to marry. The situation was spinning out of control, and Hyun felt the weight of her secret growing. When the wedding took place, it was a quiet ceremony with few guests. Taemoon, still blind, remained unaware of his bride's true identity, while Hyun, struggling with the burden of her disguise, felt the pain of hiding who she really was. In the moment he held her hand and made his vows, Hyun realized that, even if he discovered everything, she had already given part of her heart to the man beneath the arrogance and coldness. On their first night as husband and wife, Taemoon and Hyun shared the same space for the first time. He seemed more silent and reserved than usual, perhaps waiting for her to speak first. The silence was heavy, filled with secrets and fears. Hyun tried to find a way to express what she felt, but nothing seemed right. "It seems we're bound to each other now in a way neither of us expected," he finally said in a neutral tone, though there was a subtle trace of unease. She nodded, too afraid to reveal anything more. "Yes, I hope that we can be partners in everything." He nodded, and Hyun sensed that he grew slightly less rigid with each passing day. As a married couple, Taemoon began to see her more and more as his confidant, the only person he was beginning to truly trust. To him, his wife was a simple woman, yet one with intelligence and insight he hadn't anticipated, but who had somehow captured his heart. However, Hyun knew the truth was only a matter of time. Her internal tension grew daily, and the weight of her disguise was beginning to suffocate her. She desperately wanted to tell him who she truly was, but feared his reaction, feared destroying the bond they had so carefully built. Until one night, as they were discussing business matters, Taemoon made an observation that put Ha-yoon on high alert. "I feel that, even without my sight, you've always been by my side in a way I never expected from anyone." She didn't know how to respond, but in that instant she realized she couldn't keep the secret for much longer. The choice she would make would determine their future. And although she felt the weight of the love she had developed for Taemoon, she knew that the truth was the only path for them to truly be together. The weeks passed, and the bond between Taemoon and Ha-yoon quietly deepened, almost without them realizing it. The dynamic between them was marked by a hidden closeness that words could not fully express, revealing a connection beyond explanation. Yet Ha-yoon knew her time in disguise was coming to an end. Her grandfather had intensified the search for her, and the possibility of her secret being discovered grew each day. One evening, as she organized papers in the office, she overheard Taemoon on the phone, discussing urgent matters with his board. Tae Group's directors were pressuring him to form a strong alliance to bolster the company amidst fierce competition from JBC Group, her family's conglomerate. When he hung up, she noticed a weariness in his face, a mixture of frustration and resignation. Without thinking, she asked, "Is everything okay?" He turned in her direction, catching the tension in her voice, and looked surprised. "Have you ever wondered what happens when people in power feel threatened by competition?" he asked rhetorically. "They demand drastic measures." Hyun nodded, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. They fell silent, and she felt the weight of the secret she carried growing heavier with each day. But before she could plan her next step, fate took over. The following morning, as she served breakfast, an unexpected visitor arrived. Her grandfather, the president of JBC Group. The sight of his imposing figure entering the mansion made her heart race. She stepped back, hiding herself to avoid being seen, but she overheard every word of the conversation. "Mr. Ji Taemoon," her grandfather began, his tone cold and commanding, "I've come to propose an alliance between our companies, something that would solidify both groups and keep competitors at bay." Taemoon listened with intrigue. "What's your proposal?" he asked, maintaining his calm and professional demeanor. "A marriage contract," her grandfather replied bluntly. "With my granddaughter, Im Ha-yoon, we believe a union between our families would strengthen both our companies, especially in a competitive market." Taemoon was silent for a moment, weighing his options. Ha-yoon, still hidden nearby, felt her heart drop. Her grandfather had made this decision without consulting her, focused solely on consolidating their family's empire. Taemoon seemed skeptical, but he was practical enough to see the benefit of such an arrangement. "I accept," he said after a long pause. At his words, Ha-yoon felt her world shatter. In just minutes, her life had been decided without her having a say. Her grandfather gave a satisfied smile and added, "She'll be here soon. I understand your current condition may prevent a formal meeting, but I trust she'll make a good wife and bring prosperity to us both." After the visit, Taemoon seemed distant, lost in thought. Ha-yoon did her best to avoid him that day, feeling a mixture of panic and disbelief. How could he have agreed to something so impersonal without a second thought? That evening, she gathered the courage to speak to him. Determined to confront her fate, she entered his office, trying to organize her thoughts. He sensed her presence but didn't realize it was her. "Were you thinking about what you overheard today?" She swallowed hard, speaking with a shaky yet determined voice. "Yes. And frankly, I'm surprised that anyone would accept something as impersonal as a marriage of convenience." He laughed bitterly, still unaware that he was speaking to Ha-yoon herself. Life is simpler when personal and professional matters are kept separate. Power requires sacrifices, but I suppose you wouldn't understand. This time, she couldn't help but respond. "Maybe I understand more than you think." A tense silence settled between them, as if he were processing her words. He stood up, surprised by her boldness, his expression hardening. "Why do I feel like you're hiding something from me?" Her heart raced, and for the first time, she hesitated about maintaining her disguise. But before she could respond, one of the directors entered, interrupting them, and her moment of truth slipped away. In the days that followed, preparations for the wedding began, and Ha-yoon felt increasingly trapped in her lie, unable to find a way out. Meanwhile, Taemoon prepared himself for a cold, practical union, unaware that his assistant was actually the woman he would soon marry. The situation was spiraling out of control, and the weight of Ha-yoon's secret grew heavier each day. The wedding was a quiet ceremony, attended by few guests. Taemoon, still blind, remained in the dark about his bride's true identity, while Ha-yoon, carrying the burden of her disguise, felt the pain of hiding who she really was. As he held her hand and recited his vows, Ha-yoon realized that even if he discovered the truth, she had already given a part of her heart to the man beneath the arrogance and coldness. On their first night as husband and wife, Taemoon and Ha-yoon shared the same space for the first time. He was quieter and more reserved than usual, perhaps waiting for her to speak first. The silence was thick, filled with secrets and fear. Ha-yoon struggled to find the words to express what she felt, but nothing seemed right. "It seems we're bound to each other now in a way neither of us expected," he said at last, in a neutral tone, though a hint of discomfort was present. She nodded, unable to bring herself to reveal anything more. "Yes, I hope we can be partners in all things." He nodded, and Ha-yoon sensed that he grew slightly less rigid as the days passed. As his wife, she became his confidant, the only person he began to trust completely. To him, his wife was a simple woman of surprising intelligence and insight, who somehow had captured his heart. But Ha-yoon knew the truth was only a matter of time. Her internal tension grew by the day, and the weight of her disguise became suffocating. She desperately wanted to tell him who she truly was, but feared his reaction, fearing that it would destroy the bond they had built so carefully. Until one night, as they were discussing business matters, Taemoon made an observation that made her freeze. "I feel that, even without my sight, you've always been by my side in a way I never expected from anyone." She didn't know how to respond, but in that instant she realized she couldn't keep the secret any longer. The choice she would make would define their future, and though she felt the weight of the love she had developed for Taemoon, she knew that the truth was the only way for them to truly be together. The revelation was imminent, and Ha-yoon knew there was no way to keep her disguise any longer. Every word and every gesture from Taemoon only deepened the weight of the secret she carried, and the love that had blossomed between them made it impossible to keep living in this lie. Finally, after all this time pretending, she decided to tell him the truth. That night, while Taemoon sat on the veranda, she approached him, her heart racing. "Taemoon, we need to talk," Ha-yoon said, her voice soft but full of emotion. He turned his face toward her, noticing the tension in her voice. "What's wrong?" he asked, a hint of concern in his tone. "You sound hesitant." She took a deep breath, trying to gather the courage for what she was about to reveal. "I haven't been entirely honest with you," she began, feeling her chest tighten. "I'm not who you think I am." Taemoon furrowed his brow, visibly confused and uneasy. There was a tension between them, and he sensed he was about to hear something that could change everything. "What do you mean? What are you trying to tell me?" he asked, trying to stay calm. Then, with her voice trembling, she finally confessed. "Taemoon, I am Im Hayun, the granddaughter of the president of JBC Group, the woman you married, and also the assistant who has been by your side all this time." An overwhelming silence fell over them. Taemoon rose slowly, taking a deep breath as he processed her words. For a moment, he seemed unsure of how to react, and then a mixture of anger and pain crossed his face. "So, all this time you've been lying to me? Pretending to be someone else?" His voice was harsh, almost devoid of emotion, but laced with a coldness she had never heard before. Hayun felt her eyes sting with tears, but tried to explain. "Taemoon, I never intended to deceive you. I only wanted to escape my own life for a while. I didn't know I'd end up here, working for you, getting to know you like this, and falling in love." Her voice broke at the end as she struggled to hold back her tears, but Taemoon wasn't listening. He took a step back, his face hard and tense. "Falling in love? And I'm supposed to believe that after everything? Every moment, every word we shared was just part of a disguise. A lie." "No," Hayun cried, desperate. "None of that was fake. I fell in love with you, with the man I got to know. I was honest about my feelings, even if I wasn't honest about who I am." He turned his face away, struggling to contain the pain he felt, but his voice was filled with disdain. "You know, Hayun, I never needed anyone. I kept everyone at a distance because I knew in the end, people always have hidden motives. And you proved me right." She felt his words hit her like a knife to the heart. He had trusted her, and now that trust was shattered. Even though he couldn't see her, he seemed more distant and unreachable than ever. "I think you should leave," he finally said, his voice cold and unyielding, making it clear there was no room for discussion. Hayun was unable to respond. She felt frozen, devastated by the rejection from the man she loved. With a shattered heart, she gathered her things and left the mansion without looking back. As she walked away, tears streamed down her face, and she knew there was no going back. In the weeks that followed, Taemoon tried to immerse himself in work, but Hayun's absence weighed on him more and more. He threw himself into his business, but instead of finding relief, he felt empty, as if something essential had been ripped away. Everything around him seemed colorless, lifeless. Every corner of the mansion reminded him of her presence. Every silence reminded him of the conversations they had shared. He wouldn't admit it to himself, but he was in pieces. The pain of betrayal ran deep, but the ache of missing her was even stronger. Meanwhile, Hayun returned to her family, but the comfort and luxury that once felt important now meant nothing to her. She constantly thought about Taemoon and the life they had briefly shared, even though it had been complicated and messy. Regret consumed her, and she knew that, despite everything, he was the man she wanted by her side, but she feared he would never forgive her. Sometime later, Taemoon received a call from one of his assistants, informing him of an imminent merger between Tae Group and JBC Group. Taemoon, still reeling from everything that had happened, agreed to the meeting, even though it would mean facing Hayun's family, and perhaps even Hayun herself. When he arrived in the meeting room, he maintained his cold, professional demeanor, but his breath caught when he sensed her presence there. She sat beside her grandfather, but there was something different in her expression. She looked more restrained, more mature, with a gaze full of sadness and regret. After the formal meeting, Hayun approached him timidly. "Taemoon," she began, her voice gentle and filled with remorse. "I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I need you to know I'm sorry. I know I hurt you, and that's something I'll never forget." He looked at her, still struggling to believe she was really there, speaking to him again. Taemoon felt anger fighting with longing, and her words echoed in his heart. "Why now, Hayun?" he finally asked, his voice hesitant, almost vulnerable. "Why did you come back? Why should I believe you now?" Hayun took a deep breath, letting all the sincerity she felt show. "I came back because I love you. Not because I'm an heiress or because of the contract. I came back because, even if you never forgive me, I don't want to spend the rest of my life without trying. He closed his eyes, feeling a mix of pain and relief that was hard to describe. The weight of the resentment still lingered, but something stronger, a need to believe her, rose to the surface. As much as he tried to protect himself, he knew he loved her, despite everything that had happened. After a long moment, he took a deep breath and spoke in a rough voice. I don't know if I can forget what happened, but for some reason I can't explain. I want to try. A faint smile lit up Hayun's face, one of hope. She extended her hand and he took it, intertwining his fingers with hers, a silent promise of a new beginning. From that moment on, Taemoon and Hayun decided to face the future together, committed to building a relationship based on trust. Their journey had been marked by pain, longing, and regret, but the love they shared was strong enough to overcome any hardship. They knew that nothing would erase the past, but they were both ready to build a new future, together. Did you like this drama full of secrets and twists? So don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to follow all the next episodes. Share it with those who love a good love story and mystery, and comment on what you think will happen. Let's reach 1,000 subscribers together.